Wonderful. So that's recording now. Thank you everyone for joining us today. It's going to be a really wonderful talk. We've got Richard Baines with us from Yorkshire Coast Nature, who will be giving the talk about birds of Bhutan. I'm very sorry that you can't see me on screen. My camera has decided not to work today. So have to make do with our logo. So my name is Asiya. I'm speaking from Indus Experiences. We are a specialist tour operator based in Harrow in Northwest London. And we specialize on creating bespoke trips and group tours and special interest tours across Asia. And we are featuring the Birds of Bhutan itinerary, which Richard will be leading next year. He'll tell you more about that. I will just give a very short introduction to Bhutan. I'll hand over to Richard to deliver his talk. Following that, we'll have a short question and answer session. If I can please remind you to put in your questions in the little question and answer box that you will see at the bottom of the video, in the bottom of your screen. If you can put your questions there, I will pick those up and put those to Richard at the end of the talk. If you have any issues, please use a chat box. You can communicate with us and I will help you with where you get stuck. And with that done and taken care of, I'd just like to introduce Bhutan to you. Hidden deep within the folds of the great Himalaya mountains for years, Bhutan has developed its own civilization. The people living in close harmony with nature evolved a unique identity derived largely from a rich religious and cultural heritage. Bhutan is becoming increasingly known for its pure practice of Mahayana Buddhism in the tantric form, its untouched culture, its pristine ecology and wildlife, and the unparalleled scenic beauty of its majestic peaks and lush valleys. It is in many ways a magical kingdom of the past, the last Shangri-La. The Bhutanese and their small kingdom has never been colonized, a matter of great pride for them. Its ancient history, which is a mixture of the oral traditions and classical literature, tells of a largely self-sufficient population which had limited contact with the outside world until the turn of the century. In the 8th century, Guru Rinpoche established several sacred religious sites, which are important places of pilgrims for the Buddhist world today. Bhutan's population is in many ways one large family. More than 70% of the people live on subsistence farming, scattered in the sparsely populated villages across the rugged terrain of the Himalayas. The Bhutanese are, by nature, physically strong and fiercely independent, with open and ready sense of humor. Hospitality is an inbuilt value in Bhutan. Bhutan has been described as a natural paradise. Even as the world mourns the loss of its ecology, this small Himalayan kingdom is emerging as an example to the international community, which has about 70% of its land still under forest and a great variety of rare plant and wildlife species. The Buddhist philosophy of respect for all living things has resulted in a healthy environment where wildlife flourishes. That was my small introduction to Bhutan, and I'd like to hand over to Richard now, who will give our main talk this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asiya. It's great to welcome everybody to this talk. Looking through the participants, it's wonderful to see some very familiar names. Especially welcome to at least one person on the list I noticed who's been with me to Bhutan in the past, and hopefully some people who are interested in our trip next year. It's really exciting to deliver this talk. I always get very excited when I'm talking about Bhutan. And anybody who has been before, who's listening to this tonight, will know exactly that feeling. It's an incredibly exciting place to visit. So I'm going to stop my video so that you're all enjoying the talk and not necessarily seeing me on the video. So I'll stop the video now and continue talking. So the talk this evening is primarily about the 2 trips that I've done to Bhutan in February 2019 and February 2020. On those trips to Bhutan, I travelled fairly wildly in the country with the same guides that we're using next year for our trips. So I've got to know our guides extremely well. Fantastic opportunity to get to know the guides and to get that kind of quality of experience. So this talk is based on those 2 trips that I've done in the winter, and then there's a little bit at the end of the talk to give you a taste of the kind of birds that we might be seeing, and one particularly very special mammal, which we'll hopefully see next spring on our trip. So here we go. So often people are unfamiliar with Bhutan. I've spoken to many people in the past and they've been a bit confused of where it actually is. So here's a map of where Bhutan is. It lies between Nepal to its western flank and India to its east and south, and then China, Tibet to the north of Bhutan. So sandwiched between these countries in that Himalayan belt, as the mountains of the Himalayas move south and become changing in altitude and habitat. So sandwiched between those countries. Its population is less than 1 million. There's some fantastic facts on Bhutan. Anybody who's ever writing quizzes or a pub quiz, there's some wonderful facts about Bhutan, which you could always include in a quiz. First tourists in 1974. TV and internet only came to Bhutan in 1999. Despite these things, they've got an incredibly high literacy rate, very, very high quality education system. Second language, English. The national sport is archery. 70% of the country is forest. And this is my favourite one. Thimphu is the only capital of the world without traffic lights. And on my 2 visits to Thimphu, I can confirm that's true. The police in Thimphu manage the roundabouts. So that's a really good fun fact. Which you can take away from this talk, if nothing else. So,
sorry, Richard, they did have a traffic light,
but
they decided to tear them down because they were too impersonal.
Oh, that's a lovely fact. Thank you, Asia. That's really nice. Well, that's kind of typical Bhutan, really, where they prefer that personal approach. That's lovely. So this is a little bit more detail, map of Bhutan, and this is just to show people where we actually went in the 2 trips that I took to Bhutan. We landed in Paro, which is the main international airport. It's not the only airport in Bhutan, but the main international airport in the western part of the country. And then we effectively travelled from west to east through the centre of the country. The main highway, the main road system runs from west to east. That's the main accessible route through Bhutan. So if you can see this map, then the sites that we went to are on that route effectively. Pobjika Valley, which you can see in the centre, is one of the main sites we went to, one of the main areas we went to, lots of different places on the way. And then in 2019, we went down to the south of Bhutan, which is where we're going to be going next spring, to an amazing national park. And you can see at the bottom of the slide, you can tell this is a talk about birds by a birder, the Gelfu sewage farm. I don't think any talk in Bhutan, unless they were given by a birder, would have a sewage farm as part of the talk. And I'm sure birders listening to this would relate to the strangeness of that. So that's at the end of the talk. So that's kind of the route that we took, west to east through the centre of Bhutan. That's most of the visits to Bhutan take that route. Another plan, another map to show the kind of habitats and the landscape of Bhutan. This is a really interesting one because you get an impression of the kind of environments and the habitats that we travel through, and obviously that influences the birds and the wildlife that we see. The high Himalayas is predominantly, not totally, high Himalayas. The highest mountains are mainly in the north, and then as you move south through Bhutan, it's a very logical sort of thing to get your head around, which is really really helpful when you're in Bhutan. As you move south, it becomes more deciduous forests, and in the south of Bhutan, east of Bhutan, on the Indian border, that tends to be where it's the subtropical zone, closer to India. So this map really gives you a good impression of the type of habitats and landscapes that you travel through. And the valleys are the areas where obviously that main habitation is. And the tiny little valleys, which is obviously why there's such a small population, because 70% of the country is forest, and then the high, huge Himalayas. So that influences the population tremendously. So moving on now from that little introduction to the geography and the habitats and the landscapes, this is a little bit in the introduction about how I got to Bhutan. So the main way to travel to Bhutan is, or one of the best ways, is via Kathmandu. You fly from from Manchester. We flew from Manchester direct to Kathmandu, and then from Kathmandu you then fly to Paro into Bhutan. The wonderful thing about flying to Kathmandu is that it's a great opportunity for anybody who's not been there before to explore some of the tourist sites in Kathmandu. It's such a bustling, incredibly exciting city, very, very colourful, and a huge contrast to Bhutan, which is lovely, is to experience this hustle and bustle and excitement, and then the amazing differences of peacefulness and tranquility of Bhutan. So next spring, our spring visit to Bhutan, we're intending, as far as we are at the moment, to still fly to Kathmandu and spend a night in Kathmandu before flying to Paro the next day. And that's exactly what I did on the two visits that I made. Night in Bhutan, fly to Paro, and night in Kathmandu, and then fly the next day. And the wonderful thing about flying to Bhutan, anybody who's done it before will know the incredible experience of flying across the Himalayas. And across the Himalayas, you can see Everest. So I never thought, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, prior to my first trip to Bhutan, whether I would ever see Everest in my life, I'd probably say almost certainly no. This was an incredible opportunity, an amazing thing. Even seeing it from the plane was amazing. And you can imagine there's quite a hurried rush to get to the side of the aeroplane on the left-hand side, flying to Bhutan to actually see Everest. And the whole of the Himalayan range you can see on that journey. It's only about 45 minutes flight, so it's a relatively short flight. And then when we land in Bhutan at Paro, that's when you really get the first impression of what a beautiful country Bhutan is. It's without the doubt the most beautiful airport I've ever been to. Gorgeous paintings and decorations on the visitor experience, the lounge when you first arrive in Bhutan. The amazing mountains that you land between on the airfield. It is really, really special place to land. This is the arrivals lounge. As you can see, nothing like the kind of airports that we're maybe used to, especially in this country. If only Heathrow looked anything like this, it would be an amazing place to visit. And even when you actually enter, this is the baggage conveyor belt, the baggage belt, and there's even a model of a temple in the baggage belt, which I was very taken with the first time I saw it. I thought that's just amazing. So it's another example of how welcoming the Bhutanese people are to tourists. They really want people to come to visit their amazing country and have this incredible experience. So once we left the airport, we got into our little birding bus, and Norbu and his guides have this lovely bus for us with fantastic big windows, incredibly clean, which was brilliant for birding. And as you can see, one of our participants is already taking a nap there in the bus. So it was after the journey and the experience, probably need a little bit of a sleep. But as soon as we left the airport in our lovely little bus, there's birds immediately outside the airport. So you're immediately starting to go to be birding on the journey. On the journey to between Paro, the international airport where we land, and Thimphu, which is the capital, a relatively short journey, but we stop on the river on the way through to Thimphu to start to do some little bit of birding by the side of the road. It's a beautiful river, and the most iconic bird arguably in Bhutan, one of the birds that a lot of people want to see, was an ibisbill. Ibisbills are unique species. They're in their own family. So the family of ibisbills includes one species. So they're a unique family of birds. They're a similar size to a whimbrel or a small curlew, if you can imagine that kind of size, but they feed in rivers. Their whole life system depends on these beautiful Himalayan rivers. They nest in the high Himalayas during the summer and move down and spend the winter and the spring in closer to rivers in the southern parts of Bhutan. So an amazing bird to see, and relatively easy compared to other parts of the world to see ibisbill. Bhutan is one of the most accessible countries for seeing ibisbill. So that was a huge highlight. As soon as we got out of the airport, we were looking at ibisbill, so really exciting. One of the families of birds that I really enjoy seeing in the Himalayas and anywhere in the world are the redstarts. There's a wide variety of redstarts in the Himalayas and in Asia in general, and this is a beautiful example. This is a small redstart, similar in size to our common redstart in Europe, called Plumbeous water redstart. The female has this lovely spotted chest, and the male is the plumbeous colour. They feed in the centre of the river. Everybody will be probably familiar with the different niches that birds take up. The rivers in Bhutan are really fascinating because different birds take up different niches. The plumbeous water redstart in the centre of the river, so they really feed around the fastest parts of the river and on the rocks in the centre of the river. Whereas other birds, such as river lapwing, on the sides of wider rivers and feed around the grassland habitats. River lapwing is one of those birds that, again, if you try to see it in other parts of Asia, you may struggle. In northern India, in the foothills of the Himalayas, in national parks such as Corbett National Park, you could potentially see river lapwing, but they're relatively common in parts of Bhutan with these beautiful river systems. Other birds on the edges of the river taking up that niche is slaty-backed forktail. Forktails are a member of a family which are quite extensive throughout this part of Asia, and different habitats for different species of forktail. Some forktails prefer dark river systems and very dark streams in the centre of the forest, but slaty-backed forktail is one of the most visual of that family because they really like the stream sides and the open habitats. A beautiful bird, similar in habits to our grey wagtail streamside bird, but completely different family, taking up the same niche of that river system. So we have the plumbeous water redstart in the middle of the river, and on the edges of the river, around the rocks and little kind of cliff sides by the edges of the river, we have a really chunky, bigger white-capped water redstart, which are very noticeable birds, very stunning in their colour, big flash of red and black, and they tend to be on the edges of the river, feeding on the rocky areas along the stream sides. Another bird which we saw in the winter in Bhutan, coming down from the high Himalayas, and certainly we have a chance of seeing it in the spring as well, is wall creeper. Wall creeper, any birders that are familiar with European birds will know that wall creeper is a highly sought after bird to see in Europe. You often have to go into mountain areas such as the Pyrenees or the Alps to see wall creeper. In Bhutan and northern India, in the winter, they move south from the high Himalayas, and you can often see them along streams and river systems. I was very surprised the first time I went to northern India. I was watching a wagtail on the side of the river, the Koshi River in northern India, and a wall creeper flew in and joined the wagtail, feeding on the ground by the side of the river. I'd never seen wall creeper feeding on a riverbed before with wagtails, so that was a real surprise. So they feed on the sides of cliffs and rocks, such as this photograph. That's the typical habitat, but also you can find them along the rivers as well, where there's lots of invertebrates and lots of food for them to feed on. So we had our fantastic birding trip along the river before we got to Thimphu. When we arrived in Thimphu, we spent a night in Thimphu, and on that evening we had a wonderful talk by a very inspiring woman that I met on my 2019 trip, which I'll mention later in my talk. Rebecca was she worked for the Royal Society for the Protection of Nature in Bhutan, and she worked on two projects, the White-Bellied Heron Project and Blackneck Crane. And Rebecca was an inspiring conservationist. She'd worked for the Royal Society for Protection of Nature all her life, and it was wonderful to meet her on the 2019 trip. When I met her on that trip, I said, would you like to give a talk to our group and we can make a donation? And she was very keen to do that. So it was a wonderful thing to hear this talk and an opportunity for our clients to feel as though they really contributed financially and with great help to Rebecca's project. She was retiring shortly afterwards, so it would be nice for me to connect with her in the future, which I hope to do. While I was chatting to her in 2019, it was great to hear her stories, which are very similar to the conservation challenges that we have in this country. So a night in Thimphu on our 2020 trip, and then after the next morning we were on our big journey across Bhutan. On the journey which we took on both of my visits and next spring, we take every opportunity we can to visit some of the cultural sites. Often the question I have when people are interested in our trips, it says birds of Bhutan or birding and wildlife, but people often ask, will we get a chance to go to some of the temples and some of the statues? And the answer is always yes. Bhutan is one of those countries where you can't not have that amazing opportunity to visit some of the incredible statues and some of the amazing temples. So Buddha Dordima was 51 meters high, very impressive. You can see on the steps how small the people look, so you can get an impression of how huge this amazing temple is. 9 years to build, 1.25 million miniatures, incredible place. And anybody who's not that keen on the cultural side of things, there's always great birding around the temples. So we never stop, obviously, looking for birds and wildlife, even when we're around some of the cultural sites. On our journey then, away from Thimphu, we climbed up the Dochula Pass. And at the top of the Dochula Pass, there's this really, really impressive stupa 108 memorial stupas in honor of 108 Bhutanese soldiers who died in a 2003 military operation. Extremely rare for the Bhutanese army to be called into action, but in 2003 and previous to that, there'd been an incursion from the north, from China, and the Bhutanese army was called in and managed to repel the invasion, which they're very proud of. But unfortunately, there was a great loss of life. So this memorial was built, and it's incredibly impressive. And as we were there was a little dusting of snow, and you can't go anywhere in Bhutan and not take amazing landscape photographs. I am not a landscape photographer, but when I came back from Bhutan and looked at my photographs, I thought these are the best landscape photographs I've ever taken, kind of accidentally. You know, it's such a stunning country, you can't really help get some amazing landscape photographs. And this is a view from the Dotula Pass and the stupas, looking across the forest and the mountains. So that dusting of snow on the top was really impressive. And then as we moved down the valley back into different habitats, we lost the snow, and the next site we went to was these botanical gardens. When Nobu, our main guide, told us about the botanical gardens, I was expecting something a little bit more formal, a little bit maybe similar to Kew or one of the botanical gardens we're familiar with in Europe, quite ornate and maybe well looked after. But when we arrived, I saw this entrance gate and I was so pleased. A very wild entrance gate, a very kind of typical Bhutanese kind of fantastic, really an inspiring sort of wildness of this entrance gate. So the botanical gardens were a part of the forest effectively, but they were opened up for people to use. So there was some some formal areas and some picnic areas and a little lake. But then the forest took over the botanical gardens, which was wonderful. So consequently, it's a great site for birding because it becomes part of the forest. And in the botanical gardens, we saw a red-headed bullfinch, which was an absolutely lovely bird to see. One of the birds that I was really looking forward to see. As somebody said in a recent talk, it shouldn't be called red-headed bullfinch. It should be called orange bullfinch. There is another bullfinch with orange-headed bullfinch, but this is red-headed bullfinch, a male, and it was a beautiful bird to see. Another redstart, blue-fronted redstart. Blue-fronted redstarts were really great because they were very visual. They were one of the more tamer birds, so a really nice bird to photograph. Not shy at all, quite approachable, and we saw them throughout our trips to Bhutan. And so that was one of the birds that I became most familiar with because I saw many of them through the trip. In amongst the forest, we found birds in these foraging flocks. So in the same way as many forest habitats throughout the world, you walk around and it's a little bit quiet and you think there's no birds, and then suddenly there's lots and lots of sounds, lots of calls moving through the forest, and you're surrounded by birds. And in these foraging flocks, there's fantastic birds such as brown parrotbill, which are really cool birds to see, and the laughing thrushes. Laughing thrushes have got to be one of the best families of birds in Asia. They're very, very entertaining. Laughing thrushes of different species have different habitat and different sort of habits, but many of the species are very sociable. So they tend to move around in chattering flocks, staying together, communicating with each other all the time about where the food is, and mutual preening, things like this. So encountering a flock foraging group of laughing thrushes is always great fun. And this is one of the most pretty, beautiful species and relatively common in the forest, the chestnut-crowned laughing thrush. The laughing thrushes and the parrotbills would be completely new species to lots of people on these trips, different families of birds, which are exciting. Olive-backed pipit may be familiar, certainly the family, to many people who are bird watching in Europe. Olive-backed pipit is a rare Siberian bird in Europe. So if you find an olive-backed pipit in autumn in anywhere in Europe, then you'd have had a very good day. It's an exciting, rare Siberian migrant. In Bhutan, olive-backed pipit in the winter were quite common, and that's because that's the region that they spend the winter. They move from Siberia south into parts of Asia to spend the winter. So it's great to see. I love seeing familiar families and familiar birds that would be rare back at home in good numbers, which is always really exciting. In the botanical gardens, we also encountered this samba deer. I remember walking around the corner and stopping very, very quietly, thinking, "Oh wow, there's a samba deer on the track." And Nobu said, "She's a tame samba deer. It doesn't matter. We can walk past her." And it was amazing. We just walked past her and said hello, and then kept on going. Took some photographs. So another example of often how tame some of the wildlife is in Bhutan. So on our journey away from the botanical gardens, we're following the river systems, and we moved through the this fantastic, beautiful wide river system. We saw some otters down by the river, and we're heading for the Palace of Great Bliss, which is one of the main iconic palaces, where we had a little cultural tour around the palace. The Pochu Mochu River runs up to the Great Palace of Bliss, and along the river we saw birds such as Pallas's fish eagle, which are quite rare in other parts of Asia, but nest on these river systems, so that was really exciting. And some of the other species which we'd already seen, such as ibis bills and lots of plumbeous water redstarts. On our journey, we happened on an archery competition between two villages, and it really felt as though this was a serious competition. And Nobu told us that this was basically one of the highlights, one of the main archery competitions of that season. So these were two villages with rivalry. It was almost like Manchester United versus Liverpool on a Bhutanese style, or on an archery competition. Great rivalry between two villages. And the lovely thing about this experience is we were able to stop in the bus. We were able to get out, sit by the side of the bus, and watch this archery without really any effect on the competition. Nobody came over to us and sort of affected the way we were. So we were just beautiful observers. We were able to observe it and enjoy it. We were there for about over an hour, taking photographs and admiring the skill of these amazing archers and their beautiful costume. On the journey, we're looking out for special trees which are very, very good for birds, such as this coral tree. Anybody who's been birding in different parts of Asia will know the value of nectar-rich trees, where there's lots of feeding opportunities for birds. When I was in Thailand, any cherry tree which was in blossom, I immediately went to because cherry trees, especially in Thailand, tend to be full of birds when they're in blossom. In Bhutan, it was the coral trees, these incredible huge trees with these huge flowers. And if you find a coral tree flowering with lots of pollen, then you're gonna have a fantastic time for birds. Birds such as this blue-throated barbet, black bulbul. Black bulbuls come out of the forest in flocks, in feeding groups, into these coral trees. So you might have a wave of black bulbuls going through, and then after 20 minutes, half an hour, they maybe moved through and fed and keep going. So there's things always changing in these trees. You could stand for hours and watch a coral tree and watch how birds use it, and different species stick around, others move through. It's an amazing experience, and it's also an easier way to see some of the forest birds that are concentrated in one area. Bhutan laughing thrush was one of the birds we saw on our journey through Bhutan. Bhutan laughing thrush is a near endemic. It is found over the border in Nepal, but primarily in Bhutan. One of the dullest laughing thrushes, but as a near endemic, we were very pleased to see it. Hodgson's redstart. Anybody familiar with common redstarts in Europe will think, oh, that's very similar to a common redstart, which it is. That was another one of the redstart species that we saw, and it just felt like we were back home seeing a common redstart, but a completely different species. Birds of prey in Bhutan were very interesting. Most of the birds of prey we saw were forest birds, not surprisingly, because most of the environments we were in were forests. Mountain hawk eagle was one of the most regularly encountered. In flight, they're like any really big, broad-winged, rounded-winged goshawk. They've got very particular shape of wings, beautiful structure. This perched bird, I thought, was a great opportunity. I was very pleased to get this photograph because you can see the two spikes, the feather-spiked crests that they have when they're perched. So most of the birds we saw flying, but this was a lovely opportunity to get one perched because you saw this very distinctive shape of the head with the spiky crest. The bird flocks moving through the forest. Every time we stopped and we had a break and we did some birding nearby in the forest, we would encounter these foraging flocks, which I mentioned earlier. One of the most distinctive and easiest to identify small birds moving through was the black-faced warbler. Lots of species which you try to become familiar with have unusual names, and it's difficult to remember the names of the birds, especially on your first visit. But black-faced warbler does what it says on the tin. Easy to remember and beautiful bird to see. And relatively tame again. You stand there and these birds come quite close as they're moving through feeding. So that's a bird that I always remember and easy to identify. At the other end of the scale really is this Blythe's shrike babbler. But Blythe's shrike babbler is one of those species that's been separated into different species now. So they've been recognised as being much more of a near endemic in Bhutan than they were thought to be earlier. So, but a really beautiful bird. The shrike babblers are a lovely family of birds which occur in other parts of Asia as well. One of the birds that everybody wants to see, who's familiar with the birds of Bhutan and the Himalayan region, is Ward's trogon. This is a photograph taken by Norbu on one of his trips, which he kindly sent me. We didn't see it on our trip, but we're going to make a big effort to see it on our next trip in spring. The trogons are a very beautiful family of birds, but they have this very curious habit of just sitting on a branch, totally motionless and not really making any noise. So one could be sat very close to you and you wouldn't have a clue. But once you actually find one, you've got a great opportunity to watch them and photograph them because they don't fly around very much. They just sit and watch and wait for any feeding opportunities. So we're moving through the forest on our last trip in 2020, and we're driving and people are a little bit sleepy in the bus. And I think even Norbu, our main guide, had nodded off. But the driver, incredibly sharp, amazingly stopped and shouted, "Tack in," and pointed up onto this hillside. And I immediately knew what he was talking about, because I'd read about this mystical animal that can be seen in Bhutan called a takin. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't quite believe it. So we all got out of the little bus, and the photograph on the left in the bamboo is the photograph that I took. This mysterious shape in the bamboo. I was quite pleased that we didn't see it any better, because it basically kept that magical quality of this animal. It's a large ungulate. It's the national national animal of Bhutan. And there's lots of legends and lots of mysteries surrounding it. It was connected to Jason and the Argonauts, the Golden Fleece legend. And it has this amazing bloated snout look. It's through recent DNA sampling, it's now been recognized as the closest family of mammals is the sheep. So it's closely related to sheep. That's the descendants, which has been recognised through DNA sampling, which is quite remarkable. But its features are an example of convergent evolution, where it's taken on features due to its habitat and its feeding, rather than the mammals that it's most closely related to. So it was a fantastic thing to see, even though we saw it hidden in bamboo, but it just enhanced the mysteriousness. We were very lucky to see it. The right-hand photograph was one that I've taken from the internet. I think it's Chicago Zoo, this particular mammal, this particular individual is housed in, but wonderful to see it in the wild, in the bamboo. To see takins in Bhutan, some of the treks in the high Himalayas into the big meadows, there's some areas where you can see takins, but to just encounter one was really special. So moving through even further, moving east in Bhutan, if you remember that map at the beginning of the talk, the Pobjika Valley, which is kind of more or less central in that southern part or central part of Bhutan, south of the high Himalayas. When we first got to Pobjika in 2019, there'd been a snowfall. I wasn't quite sure about my reputation in Bhutan, because Nobu said that every time I come to Bhutan, it snows. But I expected it to snow in February. They don't always have snow in the Pobjika Valley in February, so it was slightly unusual, apparently. But the fact that we managed to enter the Pobjika Valley and actually get over the pass into this magical valley was really, really exciting, because the Pobjika Valley is the home of the black-necked cranes, the most famous bird, one of the most famous birds in Bhutan. In November, there's a crane festival when the cranes arrive into Bhutan. They're one of the rarest birds in the world. The population is relatively small, but the conservation work that has been done in the Himalayas, especially in Bhutan, has really helped the population. They nest, many of them, these birds nest in China, in the high Himalayas and in Tibet, and they move south to spend the winter in a couple of different places. When we were there in 2019, there was over 300 black-necked cranes had been counted. There's a big conservation project there, and they do an awful lot of work to make sure they hold on to this population and look after them. If you see the central area just above the main house in this photograph, that little sliver of ice that you can see there, lots of black dots, that's the main marsh where the black-necked cranes were roosting on that evening. So I took this on the evening when we first got there. The view from the house where we were staying, the hotel, family-run hotel, beautiful place to stay, was absolutely breathtaking. The word breathtaking is used often too much, I think, but breathtaking was definitely the word for this valley and lots of other places in Bhutan. But the view on this particular evening was really, really special. So the black-necked cranes in 2019 had this fantastic view of them in the snow, flying around the valley. Really excited to see them, especially when there was snow on the ground. When we went out, when they were leaving the roost, so in 2019 and 2020, we walked down on a little footpath and on this road, which intersected the area where they're feeding in during the day and the roost site. So we were able to see them come out of the roost and fly across the road. But as you can see, it was very cold, but it was really, really worth it to see them come out of roost early morning. So this photograph I took early morning as they were moving out. And then during the day, you encounter them in the tiny little villages in the valley, feeding in the paddocks on tubers and plant material. So you get amazing views of them during the day. They're not that shy of humans, and it's wonderful to see them just feeding leisurely during the day. You can see here there's 2 adults and a juvenile that is successfully fledged. Another photograph of them flying through the valley. Amazing birds and a fantastic valley to visit. In the valley, I was really pleased to see the cranes, but in typical kind of birder fashion, also really pleased to see some of the little brown jobs in the valley, such as Oriental Skylark, which is the equivalent of our skylark in Asia. Very rare in Europe, extremely rare. So it was lovely to catch up with them feeding in the valley in the winter. This was one of my favourite experiences in this valley, finding this wonderful flock of red-throated thrushes, about 200 red-throated thrushes feeding in this wonderful big juniper tree. And I was taking photographs and thinking there's a dark bird to the right of this male red-throated thrush. I wasn't quite sure through the camera what I was looking at, and then realised looking at the photograph that it was a black-throated thrush. So I was really excited getting a photograph of these 2 species next to each other. As well as the small birds and the black-necked cranes, when people are birding abroad, and even in this country, you might not be that interested in pigeons, but there's one beautiful pigeon, the snow pigeon in the Himalayas, which is just absolutely wonderful to see. And this photograph was taken by Ian Slingsby, who was one of my clients on the trip in 2020, and I was so impressed. The light on this photograph is beautiful, and it really gives a wonderful impression of how gorgeous these birds are. These are birds that nest high in the mountains, and because it was a winter, they come slightly further south, and it was easier to see them. Another cracking photograph, which was taken by Ian on my 2020 trip, was this Himalayan mournal. This photograph you'd think could have been taken in a zoo. It certainly wasn't. I was stood nearby when he took this picture. It was an amazing tiny little monastery that we drove up to, and it's a famous monastery when you're birding in Bhutan because of the mournals. This huge pheasant game bird, which has this amazing metallic colours on its plumage. And the monks on this tiny monastery, they would come out and feed the mournals every afternoon. So we tried to get there at a particular time, waited for 1 or 2 monks to come out and scatter a little bit of grain. And that certainly worked, in that 2 or 3 mournals came down from the mountain and gave them incredible views. Alongside the mournal, there is another really, really beautiful pheasant, which is blood pheasant. Blood pheasant is about the size of a grey partridge, if you can imagine grey partridge from birding in Europe, but really, really beautiful. But in typical fashion, as often most pheasants and game birds in their wild environments are best seen very early in the morning. Blood pheasant's no different. They're a forest bird. They spend most of their time deep in the forest. So you have to get up very early and drive up through the forest and just hope that you find a little group of blood pheasants. And we were really pleased to find this little group. by the side of the road. As soon as they saw us, they got a little bit nervous and they moved into the forest, but that gave us an opportunity to get some photographs as they hung around a little bit. That was certainly probably one of my top 10 birds that I saw in Bhutan. So that's the kind of sort of snowy environment, the sort of mixed forests and foothills of the Himalayas that we moved through. On our 2019 trip, we managed to get into an area of Bhutan. Norbu took us down into Trongsa and Tingtibi on the edges of the Manas National Park, which was very exciting because a completely different habitat. You can see here, this is subtropical zone that we're in. And on this particular trip in 2019, in this area, we were particularly interested in seeing white-bellied heron. The white-bellied heron is one of the rarest birds in the world. In 2019, when we were there's less than 20 individuals left in the world. The theory is that there's maybe the odd bird in China, but most of the birds now are in Bhutan. Their conservation is a project that Rebecca was working on at the time. We managed to see white-bellied heron not only on the side of the river, but also we were shown a nest with 4 eggs, which was really, really fantastic and a very special experience. These herons suffer from a variety of problems on these river systems. Tourism, you'd be very familiar with some of the dangers of these sort of birds because it's similar in Europe, where increased tourism can bring pressures. Increased kayaking and use of the rivers for recreation can bring increased disturbance. The other thing which white-bellied heron have as an issue is increased pylons carrying hydroelectric power across the rivers. You'll notice on that previous slide, you can see that Penny is looking down to an area and you can see the pylon. So the wires, the electricity wires across the river have been responsible for a number of deaths of birds flying into those. So despite being a country of huge environmental awareness, there are still real issues with some particular species and they have to work really hard to conserve some of the most iconic birds. So this is a bird that we'll hope to see next spring, as well as seeing it on the previous trips. Moving through the forest in this subtropical zone, we're still coming on across birds that have nested in the higher Himalayas and are wintering in the foothills and around the forest, such as rufous-breasted bush robin. Beautiful little birds that just pop up by the roadside and we stop and have a fantastic view of them. Rufous gorgeted flycatcher was another one. I was very pleased to get this photograph because you can see the tiny little bit of rufous on the throat. Not a very easy feature to see because they're often deep in the forest and flicking around. Very similar, similar family to the spotted flycatchers. Now a flycatcher, same behaviour, but lovely little bird. Completely different family to the ones that we're used to, the flycatchers, the pipits, is the Mesia, the silver-eared Mesia. This is a bird that I first encountered in Thailand, and again, this was just on the roadside. It's such a beautiful bird. Often you can find them in fruiting trees, such as the coral tree or cherry trees. Really lovely bird to encounter. So when we were down in Manas National Park, we stayed in a tiny little hamlet, and walking out from the small hotel, we encountered some amazing species. Having just seen the black-necked cranes in the Pobjika Valley and the skylarks in the snow, this was completely different. This was like going to a different country. To be in the subtropical zone was fantastic. And this rufous-necked hornbill was one of the best birds I saw there. I was concentrating on finding a tiny little warbler, and one of our group walked up to me and said, "There's a hornbill sat just above your head," which I'd completely missed because I'd been concentrating on watching a little brown warbler down below me. Amazing view. They just sit around in the tree looking for the fruit, and a fantastic opportunity for photograph. As well as the rufous-necked hornbill, just around the corner on the same roadside, we've also found a great hornbill. Huge bird, absolutely enormous. If nobody's seen great hornbill before, it is quite an experience to see one. You get them in India, northern India, in other parts of the region, but it was great to see one there as very close to the rufous-necked hornbill. As well as the hornbills, we also saw a giant squirrel in the same place, and this fantastic golden langur. Golden langur are very restricted. They're one of the langur species which are only found in very small areas of the Himalayas. So that was a really lovely experience. We found a little troop of langurs, and we were able to spend some time watching them moving through the trees. As well as the large birds and the langurs, we also saw one of the scimitar babblers. This is one of the more striking scimitar babblers, the coral-billed, which has that fantastic red bill and big black eye stripe and the white supercilium. So a really striking bird in the forest. Another laughing thrush, striated laughing thrush, very streaky, not so sociable as some of the others. You tend to see them in ones and twos, so different type of behaviour, but one of the many different species of laughing thrushes in the family. So moving down from Manas National Park, we were taken by our guides, Norbu and Pema. This is Pema in the photograph with his camouflage trousers on, to this sewage farm. Pema and Norbu were very excited because, as very keen birders, they don't get a chance to visit this particular sewage farm very often. So they were really excited, as excited as you could imagine, really, but always very curious and always have a laugh when I think about how excited we are visiting these strange places as birders. This sewage farm is right on the border of India, and because of its location, it receives migrants in this particular lowland area that other parts of Bhutan don't attract. So it was a great chance to find birds that we could only dream of seeing in Europe, such as pintail snipe, masked wagtail, one of the Siberian races of water pipit, brown shrike, Siberian ruby throat. And as we were birding there, I had a brief view of a paddy-field warbler. And this is a typical experience in Bhutan where you see something and you've got to be really careful because it could be extremely rare, because this is a country that not many birders have been to, relatively. So the chance of finding something that's extremely rare in Bhutan is really high. And I mentioned to Norbu that I'd just seen a paddy-field warbler, and he looked at me as if I'd gone completely crazy. He said there'd never been a record of paddy-field warbler in Bhutan. They were expecting one. They're not far away in India, so he was really keen to see it. Unfortunately, we couldn't find it again, and I didn't get a photograph, so it's kind of one that got away, really. But this sewage farm attracted lots of Siberian migrants, which we were really pleased to see. Another example of something that you're not really quite sure about when you see them was this common gull. So anybody listening to the talk tonight will remember this, who came with me in 2020. We were stood at the top of this river system, and we were looking with telescopes down the river for birds such as ruddy shelduck, the two ruddy shelducks, ibis billows, things like that. And I found a gull. And if you see any gull in Bhutan, it's extremely rare. There are no gulls in Bhutan. Landlocked country without really habitat for gulls. So Norbu was very excited, and we drove down to get a closer look. And the two Bhutanese birders, Norbu and Pema, were beside themselves. They were very pleased. It was the first common gull they'd ever seen. So I managed to find a second record for Bhutan, which was common gull. Of course, we see them very commonly here, but it was lovely to encounter these birds as an extra excitement of the trip. Another bird we saw in the south of Bhutan on the Indian border was Indian peafowl, peacock. When you see them in Asia, whether you see them in India or Bhutan or Nepal, then you can't help just thinking this is one of the most amazing birds in the world. I think if I hadn't seen them growing up in zoos and parks in Europe and the UK, then I would probably completely be blown away. There's such an amazing bird to see, and really beautiful when you see them in the wild. You can't help but just be stunned, really. Amazing birds. So the end of this trip in 2019 and 2020, and the end of the trip next year, we will be visiting Tiger's Nest. When you Google Bhutan, the most photographs that come up is Tiger's Nest. It's the most iconic place for tourists. It's the only place on the 2 trips that I did where we saw more than just 1 or 2 tourists. We didn't see tourists hardly at all on the whole trip. But Tiger's Nest is a popular destination because people can fly into Paro and visit it relatively easily. The temple is located high on the cliffs, but on the walk to the temple, which is a fantastic walk up through the forest, is great birding. And this, one of the reasons it's great birding is because it's a very old ancient forest, has these fantastic lichens and mosses dripping from its branches. And we saw birds such as Darjeeling woodpecker, a really beautiful woodpecker on the walk up to the temple. Black-faced laughing thrush, which took a bit of patience trying to get some good views, but then hopping out of the bushes. Often these birds in these forest environments are not shy, but it's difficult to see them because of the amount of vegetation and scrub and forest. So just a little bit of patience and you get incredible views such as this. Up at the temple, I was really pleased. The most impressive birds I saw around the temple itself were 3 species of accenta. Everybody gets really fantastic views of great, huge species such as the black-necked crane and the hornbills, but the small birds can be just as equally as impressive. And around the edges of the temple, I found 3 species of accenta. And there's not many places in the world. In fact, this may be one of the very few places in the world where you could actually see 3 species of accenta right next to each other, effectively. So one was alpine accenta, the other one was Altai accenta, and this beautiful rufous-breasted accenta. Rufous-breasted accentas are relatively common in the winter. Another Siberian Himalayan species which moves south and can be found throughout Bhutan in the winter. But it was really special to see these 3 species right next to each other in the temple. So finally in the talk, I'll talk a little bit about our spring trip for 2024. What's in store next year? We're going to spend 3 weeks in the Bhutan between the end of April and the 3rd week in May. Really exciting, immersive experience. We're going to do some fantastic birding and some great cultural visits. There's some key species that we really want to see. This is one of the key species, Satyr tragopon, this amazing game bird with these amazing colours. Himalayan cootia, which is a wonderful, beautiful, quite unique family of birds which you only find in Asia. That's another one of the birds we'll be looking for. Beautiful nuthatch. Nuthatches are one of the families that everybody will be familiar with. We have nuthatches in the UK, but this is the most beautiful nuthatch in the world, arguably. And I'm really looking forward to seeing that. And one of the species which has just come up in the last few years is Nobu on his recent treks and his recent tours in Bhutan. He's managed to find some sites for red panda. It's not something that I thought we'd ever get a chance to see. So I'm very excited about the potential to see red panda. We're going to go into a special national park and search for these animals. So that'll be really exciting if we manage to find red pandas. So that's really on the cards. So it would be wonderful to welcome anybody who might be interested in our trip next year. We are leaving at the end of April. We get back third week of May. It's a 3-week trip, wonderful opportunity to really discover an amazing country and not only the birds and the wildlife, but also the culture. And for an itinerary and a free 2020 trip report, I can send you them by email, and just make a note of my email on this slide and send me an email, any information that you might want about that trip. So I hope you've all enjoyed the talk. I've really enjoyed presenting it. Every time I look at my slides, I think, wow, I can't wait to get back there. So I'm going to hand over to Asia again, and we'll take some questions. Anybody who has a question, they can put it in the chat, and it'd be lovely to catch up with people through that. So I'll hand back to Asia now.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was really amazing. And for almost every slide you said, this was really rare, and we saw that. So that's wonderful. Yeah, lots and lots and lots of varieties, and it's absolutely amazing. The landscape and all of that was fascinating. If anyone has any questions, please do put them in the question and answer box below. If you can't, you can raise your hand and I'll come to you. We've got one question from Andy Golder, which is, what is the food and the accommodation like on the trip?
Thanks, Andy. That's a great question. I'm glad somebody asked that. I always hope somebody asked that question. I was really, really pleased with both things. The first time I went, I was interested in the same way as anybody would be on the standard of accommodation, particularly. It's really important on our trips. We wouldn't be taking people abroad if we didn't have really, really nice, very comfortable accommodation. I couldn't believe how beautiful it was. Often family-run hotels, very comfortable, very warm, very spacious, even with quite good Wi-Fi. Often Wi-Fi better than it is in the UK. So I can only sort of recommend how fantastic some of the accommodation is. So I wouldn't hesitate to say it's really beautiful. The food situation, I think the food is probably similar to the northern part of the Himalayas. In most of Bhutan, it was sort of a lovely combination of rice and vegetables and sort of meat if you eat meat. In Bhutan, they really like chili. So often what happened is we would have particular types of vegetables and beautiful selection of food, and then the guides may eat separate food separately because they eat a lot hotter chili than we would ever eat. Chili is kind of one of the most sort of the favoured foods of Bhutan. But yeah, the food was beautiful, really lovely, and it was great. Both the accommodation and food were fantastic.
If I can just add there, for anyone who has any food allergies or food intolerances, and you're concerned about that, just do let us know. Hotels can cater to you,
Yeah.
As long as they have, information in advance. So that's not an issue at all. And the hotels, they do temper the food according to for tourists. So you're not. So as Richard said, they're not going to be feeding you the proper chilies. So.
If you like chili, it's the best country in the world to visit. I can tell you that.
Thank you for that. Jill, she says, did you get altitude sickness?
Good question, Jill. None of us got altitude sickness. I think we were all fine. I think one of the advantages of a slow journey through the country and landing in Paro, which is relatively high, is that your body has lots of opportunities to become accustomed to altitude. On both trips, we never went any higher than 3,000 meters, and on this trip, the next trip, it's going to be sort of similar. So we don't go to the really big heights of 4,500, 5,000 meters. So that helps enormously. So there'd be virtually no risk of altitude sickness. And as I say, it helps in that there's the journey through Bhutan it has a fantastic opportunity for acclimatization to the relatively benign heights that we will be at.
Fantastic. Karen asks, what about insects?
Another good question. Thanks, Karen. Insects on the trips that I was in weren't a problem at all. I think in the spring there may be taking insect repellent is important. We didn't have any problems. It's not something that I'm aware of is a problem. So in the same way as you would take precautions with insect repellent in other parts of Asia and India, visiting these kind of environments, then you would be the same in Bhutan. The advantage of being further north is huge in the sense that there's a lot less risk of malaria. So within these environments, a lot less risk of malaria than in, for example, southern India and southern Thailand and places like that. So further north you go, then the lot less there is to worry about.
Fantastic. If anyone has any questions, please do put them in the box and we'll get to them. While we wait for someone else to ask a question, one of the frequent questions we get are about visas. So let me just answer that. So for your Bhutanese visas, we would be applying for the visas on your behalf. So there's no paperwork for you to do. All we will need are your passport copies. We send them in advance. We apply for the visas and you don't need to do anything. This tour does start off in Kathmandu. For Kathmandu, they do have a visa on arrival system. So you just take a bit of cash, take your forms, you can get them at the airport. If you're not keen on that, you can get them on advance of travel as well for anyone who doesn't want to do that. So there's very simple, very easy to get, no complications there. Sarah Little, thank you for your question. She says, how much hiking are you able to do versus being on the bus, please?
Good question, Sarah. I'm really pleased that everybody's asked these questions. So the hiking situation and time on the bus, we will be having as many opportunities for stops as possible. So on the 2 trips that I've done in Bhutan, there's constantly places there where we can stop and have a little hike and a break. And then when we have overnight accommodation, when we stay in an area and do some birding, then it's leisurely walks, leisurely hikes. People often ask what distance that we're hiking. We're basically hiking, so the distance that birders hike, so relatively short walks, only a few kilometers each day, for example. So nothing in any way trying or difficult, no huge distances, and lots of stops on the journey. And every time we stop, it's a wonderful opportunity to do a little birding near the bus or the cafe that we might be nearby.
Fantastic. Andrew Stockham asks, how many people are on the trip?
So there's 10 clients, 10 spaces we have. We've got 3 bookings so far. We've got 7 spaces, and there'll be me and then 2 guides. So there'll be a high guide to client ratio, which we always like to have on all our trips, because then people feel as though they get an enormous amount out of the trip and lots of attention. in the group. So 10 clients and up to 3 guides.
Fantastic. I think we're done with the questions, but let me just also say we do have other birding tours for anyone who isn't, who the dates don't work for, or who isn't interested in going very long haul. We do have some short haul birding tours as well. I'll send you all an email with all of that information on it for anyone who's interested and wants to have a look around. I think we're done with the questions. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Richard. And I think we'll end the session here.
Thanks very much for everybody attending, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.